My name is Sofia Ehrich, and I'm an art historian, researcher, and consultant for multisensory experiences. My company, the olfactory contractor, coaches and consults museum practitioners and others on the educational impact smell can have on the public. It is my pleasure to welcome you as the host of the Internet of Senses Institute podcast for the Sense of Smell. And today I'm very excited to have Professor Charles Spence with me, who is a world-renowned experimental psychologist specializing in neuroscience-inspired multisensory design. His work focuses on how the human brain integrates information from different senses to shape perception, particularly regarding food and dining experiences, otherwise known as Gastrophysics. He is an established author of over 1,200 academic articles and several popular books, including the international bestseller Gastrophysics. So welcome, Charles.
Yeah.
I'm excited to interview you today because I've been a fan for a long time. So can you briefly introduce yourself a little less formally than I just did and explain your background, maybe some of your research around smell, but you can also talk about taste. I mean, they overlap, right? So
I'm an experimental psychologist working here at the University of Oxford, where I've been for almost 30 years now teaching. I run the Crossmodal Research Laboratory, where we are interested in the senses and how they interact, trying to understand, take the latest insights from brain science and neuroscience about how sight changes hearing and hearing changes touch and touch changes smell, and these latest insights about sensory interactions, and apply them to the real world, to the design of all sorts of experiences, be it food and drink related, that would be the gastrophysics, but also a lot around olfactory design, or what I like to call sort of scent-tainment.
entertainment.
Yeah, hopefully the title of my next book. I've got all the sort of chapters there, just looking at how olfactory cues, scents, good or bad, have been used in a whole range of contexts, from ancient Greece and Rome through live performance and virtual reality and smelly cinema, and then of course smelly dining and smelly VR and smelly anything really, smelly books. And that's sort of a nice example of taking a sense that people often don't think much about, smell, because we're all visually dominant. We always think about vision first and foremost, and sometimes only, to think about how scent can be incorporated into multisensory design and what sort of cross-modal effects it might have. So the way that the addition of a smell might affect your enjoyment of what you're watching or what you're doing, or your memory for it, or how intense the experience is, or whatever else it might be.
And how did you get into this topic? Like, because you said you've had the research lab for 30 years, or you've been at Oxford for 30?
Research lab for nearly 30 years, been in Oxford for 33, I suppose. And just all by accident, really, as these things maybe normally are. When I was an undergraduate here in 1990, I had to do a project and left things very late. And somebody sent me off to see this guy who had a broken TV, who happened to be a DJ in his spare time. And he would have his DJ deck speakers playing the sounds of his TV. In those days, in the 1990, you still had VHS recorders in the flats and apartments. And there was kind of this sort of sensation of people would come around to watch a movie and put the VHS in, and the credits roll, and everything seems just normal. And then the first character speaks on the screen, and suddenly there's a disconnect because the voices are coming from over there somewhere where the DJ decks are, not from the voice, the lips on the screen. And then a few seconds later, your brain would sort of ventriloquize the sounds so that now it did seem like the person on the screen was talking after all. And my first experiments then back in 1990 were breaking televisions effectively and moving the sounds around to see what was easy and what was hard for people to listen to. And then the 35 years since then, I've been just sort of adding senses. Next came, that was hearing and vision. Then came touch, and then smell, and then taste, and then pain, and then anything else we can think of, pheromones, I don't know. And hopefully with sort of the idea that our brains will use the same rules no matter which combination of senses it's thinking about or perceiving, but that some combinations of senses are kind of easier to study and hence maybe to understand. Because you can, with a computer, you can present people with lots of lights and sounds and understand how hearing and vision, eyes and ears are connected very easily. But when it comes to taste or flavor, to the gastrophysics, then it's suddenly much harder because you've got to make the food and you've got to wash up afterwards, and then your subjects get full up if you give them too much stuff to eat. So that's really messy and slow and difficult. If the same rules of integration apply for hearing and vision on the computer screen as they do for taste and smell in a dish in a fancy restaurant, then you can sort of hopefully get a head start of understanding flavor through these other senses. And that's been kind of the way, the route throughout of just sort of studying easy to study senses and trying to apply them to less studied, harder to study senses like touch, like taste, like smell.
Do you have a favorite sense? Maybe
Oof.
to research or to also use? Do you have a favorite sense?
Oh, it wouldn't be taste, gustation, because there's not much going on there. So I wouldn't mind losing that one. Probably smell or sound. It's got to be something other than vision, because everyone else talks about vision all the time. So we're trying to get rid of the visual dominance in society and science. Smell or flavor, really, well, or smell, flavor, sound. Maybe flavor, because that's my sort of research started out in the hearing and vision, and then eventually by accident got into food and the chemical senses of smell and taste. And after a little while working with food, I sort of got to realize that you got to meet some nice chefs and mixologists, and then got to go to conferences where the food was a whole lot better than chefs conferences than it was at psychology conferences. And so kind of pivoted my research accordingly so that I got to eat more nice food and drink. And so that has certainly been one of the benefits of this research, and probably the one I enjoy most is getting the opportunity sometimes to eat some very nice and innovative food and drinks.
So you said there's not much going on there in terms of taste. Can
Mhm.
you unpack that a little bit
Yeah.
and also maybe explain the difference between taste and flavor?
Well, taste and taste.
Taste and
Yeah. So
taste
it's
and
so
smell.
a whole kind of convoluted mess, in as much as in everyday life we say, I love the taste of this, I don't like the taste of that, but we're not really talking about taste as a scientist thinks about it, which is gustation, which is what your tongue gives you when you eat something, and namely only sweet, bitter, salty, sour, and umami. In fact, most of what we enjoy in the taste of food when we're eating and drinking really comes from the nose, from the kind of the retronasal smell, so the smells that get pushed out of the back of your nose when you chew and swallow. And that gives you the fruity, the meaty, the creamy, the burnt, the carbonated, the citrus, the floral, all the interesting stuff in flavor or taste comes from the nose. But our brain, again, I think does this sort of ventriloquism trick on us and takes these smells that are perceived in the nose and then convinces us all we're tasting them in our mouths. Hence why we say, I love the taste, because it feels like it's coming from the tongue, even if I can show you it's not, with a nose clip and some jelly beans, as I was doing with a bunch of school kids last week. So it's hard to know what to do. It sort of depends on your audience, but I will try and distinguish taste from flavor. So what we really need is a new word, something like I love the flavor of that. What we should be saying, but hasn't caught on just yet. And hence, very often people come, not very often these days, but sometimes when people come, say, doctor, doctor. Not that I am that kind of doctor. Doctor, I can't taste food anymore. Can you help me? And nearly always when they come, their sense of gustation, sweet, bitter, salty, sour, is just perfect. Their tongue's fine. What they've lost is their nose, either because of a car crash where they've damaged the front of their head, or some sort of virus or cold or something that's knocked out the olfactory receptors in the nose. But no one realizes it. They all think they've lost the taste of food. In fact, they haven't. And that sort of hints at how little taste gives us, really. And some of my favorite old experiments of, well, horrible examples from the Napoleonic Wars. I think Brillat-Savarin writes about, I think that's right, where the French soldiers would chop out the tongues of the Algerian prisoners, but it had no effect on taste. Even they got no tongue, didn't seem any problem. And then in the 1960s, a psychophysicist of taste, Zoterman, he got herpes, and that systematically wiped out all of his taste buds on his tongue. And being a good psychophysicist, somebody who studies the perception, he systematically documented his own taste perception as his tongue stopped working. And again, very little impact. Whereas with these little kids I was torturing last week, give them a nose clip and then some Bertie Beanbot horrible jelly beans, earwax and bogies and dirt and all sorts of nasty things. With the nose clip on, they put the jelly bean into their mouth. You say, "What are you getting?" And they say, "Nothing much. It's just the taste. Maybe sweet, maybe a bit sour. Anything else? No. Okay, now take your nose clip off." They take the nose clip on. Suddenly they'll go, "Ugh, that's disgusting," because of the smell of the earwax or the bogey or whatever it might be. But a moment ago, they didn't realize it. They were tasting this thing happily, but not really tasting because they weren't smelling. And only when they took the nose clip off, when the that's 90% of what we think we taste, we smell was revealed, did it become a disgusting experience. you understand why my brother would never let me near my nieces without an adult present.
It's so funny. I actually do the jelly bean test with when I teach. I do that as well, and it's always remarkable how people respond to it, because even though it's such a simple thing,
Yep,
but it really is like it's so educational in terms of
yep,
learning the difference between your sense of taste and your sense of smell. In this case, it's kind of what
yep,
makes flavor happen,
yep.
and so yeah, it's a great test. I've never done it with a nose clip though.
No, oh no,
I,
that's
I
just
always tell people to pinch their
yeah,
nose.
yeah, 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 yeah. So of course that works just as well. But then if you put the nose clip on, then you can say like, you're going deep sea diving. So now, Paul, put your nose clips
Uh-huh.
on, and the nasal voice gets them laughing as well.
Exactly. Okay, so something that I find really fascinating and that you spend a lot of time on is cross-modal perception, which we've kind of already talked about.
Yeah.
But for those who don't know what cross-modal perception is, can you explain it? Maybe also how it acts or shows itself in everyday
Yep.
life?
So when one delves into the multi-sensory sphere, of then two terms crop up: multi-sensory and cross-modal, and often there's kind of a confusion about what are they saying the same thing or are they different things. I think for most people they're saying the same thing. For me, they're saying different things. I would say sort of multi-sensory or multimodal is kind of when different senses come together and they give you a combined percept or object. So maybe you can see my lips, you can hear my voice. Those two come together into this sort of multi-sensory perception of speech. Or the example of flavor just mentioned, where taste and smell and maybe chemisthesis and the pungency of ginger and pepper and chili, they all come together to deliver a flavor. And that's like a multi-sensory percept of flavor. So it engages multiple senses but comes together into one thing. By contrast, I'd use cross-modal to describe those situations where one sense affects another without necessarily they're coming together into one thing. So, for example, if I was sort of, to clap my hands like that, a sudden loud noise may make the lights look a bit brighter, and that would be you don't combine the slapping of the hands with the light, but nevertheless, the sound, unexpected sound, makes you more aroused. When you're more aroused, it might make the light look brighter, and so that would be a cross-modal effect there. And then maybe also sometimes in a sort of entertainment sphere, then if you add scent to some sort of entertainment experience, it might make the whole thing more pleasurable without necessarily being incorporated into what you're experiencing. So again, sort of cross-modal effect.
One that I think that you've also said is, for example, when you see a pink food, whether it's a pink drink or pink cereal or
Mhm.
something, then there's an expectation that that thing will be sweet or taste a certain
Yep.
way. And if it doesn't, then your body's a bit, or your perception's a bit confused. That's, I think, also a very good example
Mhm.
of
Yeah.
cross-modal perception, right?
I mean, I've never seen a pink cereal myself, but yeah, so say pink yogurt or pink ice cream or pink bubble gum, then you see that and you think sweet straight away. Everyone does, probably more or less, and probably maybe strawberry or red fruit. And then when you taste that thing, you don't taste the redness or the pinkness. It sort of set your expectations. So that's kind of vision cross-modally setting expectations and hence influencing taste and flavor. And if what your eyes told you is kind of broadly what you get, then I think we live in the world of our visual expectations. We taste what we saw and what we expected. And then sometimes when you're in molecular restaurants or design stores or just badly designed experiences, things look one way. And then when you taste them or pick them up, we experience them very differently. And that's kind of normally a bad experience. So I start a Gastrophysics book with this sort of pink ice cream that was served as a test dish in a Fat Duck restaurant in Bray, the world's top restaurant. It was around that time from Heston Blumenthal. And when guests tried this for the first time, they saw a pink ice cream. They thought it was really horrible. And here was the world's best chef, soon to be announced, who thought this dish was perfectly seasoned. He gives it to people and they say, no, it's horribly salty. And you think, what's gone wrong there? And it's this kind of disconfirmation of expectation that the chef knew it was a historic savory ice cream and he knew that pink color meant frozen crab bisque or smoked salmon because it was a new dish. He hadn't given the dish a name yet. So when he tried it out on his customers, he just said, here's a new dish. What do you think? They saw the pink, they expected sweet, they got savory, fishy or crabby. And that's such a big disconnect that your eyes can't overrule your taste buds or nose. And that's kind of yeah, a negatively valence, a very unpleasant sensation, and people tend to then rebound further away from the actual taste when they've been so tricked, and that's kind of negative because if something's in your mouth and you don't know what it is, or it's not what you thought it was, then that could poison you. And you're sort of eating and drinking being among life's most dangerous activities, then getting it cross-modally wrong in your mouth when you're about to swallow is yeah, potentially life-threatening and hence normally unpleasant.
It's very interesting because that's also the challenge of doing research in that part of your senses, right? In taste, because people are a bit more hesitant when it comes to putting things in their mouths and experimenting with that because they don't know what to expect, or if they look at something and they think they're going to expect something, then it's not. It can be very jarring. So that's a very interesting case that you mentioned.
Yeah. And then at the same time, sort of challenging because you can give people something unexpected to taste once, but you can't keep doing it because then they expect the unexpected. So it's hard to get enough data to sort of, do the robust science that people love these days. And then maybe there's something about when we take some of these funny colored ice creams. I always remember bacon and egg ice cream that was also popular from this chef 15 years ago. Works beautifully in the restaurant. Bacon and egg ice cream. That's like, no one's ever heard of that. Works perfectly in the restaurant. People love it there. We'd get batches of the ice cream to give to our participants in the lab in Oxford. And people say, God, it's horrible. Same ice cream, but the context is different. And when we give it out, it just feels like a badly designed thing. But when it comes from the hands of a creative genius in sort of a hallowed temple of modernist cuisine, then you say, well, that's a bit strange, but it must be intentional, and then sort of appreciate the trickery and magic for what it is.
It's so interesting because also like a lab is where you need to do research in a way, but then like if you're doing this kind of research you need also maybe you need the original context in which the ice cream was presented. I mean, because
Yeah,
you're researching that, right? Like that's
yeah,
cross-modal perception. The environment that you're in affects what you're eating. And if there's somebody screaming in the background as you're eating your food, your experience may be different than if they weren't screaming. It's kind of what you're studying. So it's really
yeah.
interesting.
Another cross-modal effect for you.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, at the same time, then there are also, lots of quotes from chefs going back to 1900. I think that's Escoffier saying, I lie awake at night, tossing and turning because trying to figure out the next new dish for my guests. They always want something new. And nowadays, I think many of these diners want the unexpected because all the flavors have been discovered, really. So what's new is something that's kind of, incongruent or surprising in some other way. So there are people who sort of a healthy number of people who are looking for this kind of experience. And then what we try and do is, I mean, occasionally we've had in the lab in Oxford before it was knocked down with asbestos 9 years ago, and we had no more lab. We've got a new one now, about 3 months ago. But then we had a Michelin trained chef, Charles Michel, in the lab, our chef in residence. And for a while, he was very interested in Kandinsky's paintings and the notion of sort of synesthesia and edible art and artists communicating emotion through color and form, which is what Kandinsky says of some of his work. And the chef thinks, well, I want to do the same thing myself. And so he made a edible Kandinsky salad, painting 201, hanging in Museum of Modern Art in New York. And that we would give to people sometimes in the lab, but then he would make a nice round table with a white tablecloth and silver cutlery. We'd invite people in for a table for one to eat this salad in a sort of semi-naturalistic situation. And then at the same time, we're always looking for those opportunities to test people in the wild. So Somerville College, where I teach, there we had 150 parents and their offspring came for a lunch one day, and that's a perfect opportunity to have people eating real food in a naturalistic dining situation and evaluate it. And why working with chefs like Joseph Youssef at Kitchen Theory in London is great, because in the context of his kind of gastrophysics chef's table, diners are kind of amused and curious to take part in a couple of experiments. Not for every dish in their meal, but it sort of fits in the sort of sense of you're coming here to learn something, but also to find out and to contribute to research. And we'll illustrate some of the latest developments in the science of the senses and cross-modal stuff for you. And so there, quite often we have, a course or two that are actually sort of experiments where diners will eat the food and then maybe get a little postcard with some questions. What do you think of the food? What do you think of the music? How much would you pay for this dish? And that's it. And that's sort of great then to have, as ecologically valid as possible data from real diners and real restaurants paying real money for the food. And if you can find the same sorts of results there as you get in a highly controlled but ecologically invalid environment of the science lab, testing mostly weirdos, the Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic boys and girls studying psychology, then that's pretty good.
Can you explain the Crossmodal Research Laboratory? Like how did it come to be? What is it? And you're saying it's still active today, right?
Yeah. So came into being when I was appointed as a lecturer in whatever October '97, and so the name for the people in my group. So that currently that's about 8 PhDs and 3 or 4 visitors and of people who are interested in the senses, and they have to be interested in more than one sense to get in. Which ones? So it depends on the individual. I've got people who are chefs who are interested in music, so they're doing music scent matching. I've got sort of culinary anthropologists, kind of, and they're interested in history of spices and the senses and personality. And we've got other people who are singers who are more interested in the music. I don't really tell people which senses they should focus on. They've got to pick two or more, and then sort of look for synergies between people who arrive, somebody who's great at using AI to design the latest food images, with somebody who knows about music, which I don't, with somebody else who can cook, which I can, but I don't do for research. And then, some of the best, things happen when, like when the chef Charles Michel came to the lab. He's a chef, can make beautiful food, but he can't do statistics to save his life. The statistician is great at statistics, but she can't cook to save her life. Put them two together, and you've got a beautiful series of experiments that no one's ever done before. And it's just that sort of connecting people with a sort of shared passion for the senses, and preferably with a vision to seeing how it might be applied. So maybe starting out theoretically, well, how do these senses connect in the brain and what are the rules? But then thinking, okay, if we know that, then how could we apply this to make driving safer, make hospitals less painful, make food taste better, make cinema more enjoyable, and so on.
What kind of collaborations have you had in your research lab? I mean, you've mentioned a few,
Yeah.
like chef, music.
Yeah, all sorts of people. A lot with chefs, with mixologists, with chocolatiers, with perfumiers, with composers, with sound designers, with DJs, with typeface designers, with plate designers. Yeah, pretty much anybody or anything really. Food chemists, art historians, anthropologists, and then all the things that sort of food and drinks companies can sort of provide as well in terms of master blenders or chef du cave. Was are open to collaborate with anybody, and I think it's so people often say, well, how do you go about doing this? We want to do some interdisciplinary research, or we'd like sort of companies to fund some of our research, and I sort of think it's impossible to know who to contact. So I think it's sort of hard for me to say, well, we're interested in typeface, because that's a whole area of research that no one's looked at ever since Apple came out with the first printer, whatever, that could do multiple typefaces in this, and it could have passed psychology by. But every typeface has a taste, has a different sort of qualities that could cross-modally influence. So if you write "taste me" in an angular font, then your jelly bean will taste more acidic or sour. Put it in a curvy font, it'll taste more sweet. That's a cross-modal effect, but you have to wait till you find a typeface designer who's interested in this area, and then she can or he can create the typeface, and we can sort of help design the experiment and the food. And so it's just a matter of sort of waiting around and seeing who turns up, really. And then there's probably always something to be done. We had a Joe Buzlinowski who's just got a book out on multisensory crossmodal art, I think it's called, and sensory terroir. And she was like a professional wine judge, but also a sound artist. And then she came to the lab for a while. And that's great then to create soundscapes that match particular wines and maybe recorded in the vineyards. And away you go, another thing. With chocolatier, Dominic Persune, he's like this great sort of a 2 Michelin star chocolatier to the stars, has 6 chocolate shops in Belgium, made the chocolates for Ronnie Wood's 80th birthday party from the Rolling Stones. They can snortable chocolate. Very crazy and wacky. Working with him, we can go into his shops and have hundreds of consumers who come in to buy chocolate. Say, will you come aside for a minute? Come and give you a free chocolate. Sit over there, put these headphones on, taste the chocolate, and listen to this music, which might be creamy, to make the chocolate creamier, or we say this music inspired the chocolatier to make the chocolate I'm giving you, versus a scientist says this music's the best match for the chocolate, and a whole range of experiments we can do there. And yeah, it just goes on like that, really. Find a perfume maker, then they know all sorts of things, and they've got all sorts of little compounds and volatile aromas in their cabinets that they can play with, and for maybe each one has some associations for them that are special with textures and colors and shapes, and that's a whole line of experiments there, and it just goes on and on, endless stuff to be done.
So you talked about when you first got into this
Yeah,
cross-modal thing
yeah,
was to do with a TV, right? Because the
yeah,
lips weren't lining up with the sound. So is that when you first discovered that the senses overlap each other or that
yeah.
they interact with each other? Or did you
No, that was
slowly
it. The
discover
first.
that?
Yeah, yeah. I wasn't really interested in the senses, and I'm just whatever a sport, playing, drinking undergraduate who had better things to do than research, and then got into that, and then yeah,
So
we had
then
a
you
project.
slowly,
So
I guess, expanded
yeah,
beyond sound.
yeah, and it sort of in the end, I think, sort of in hindsight, appealed in part because in those days there was a lot of sort of building stuff because computers couldn't. How do you get the sounds from TVs to come from different locations? That requires you to build relay boxes and solder loudspeakers and Cali fudge stuff, and so I sort of like that building and making part of the research and the programming computers to get things to do stuff. And it was also nice in a way. Before I started my PhD, I went for a year to Germany to the European Space Agency to do human computer interaction, which was very big at the time. And there we have like a model of humans, and you'd put it together with a model of a system, which might be the first email systems back in 1990, didn't exist, or the interface in a car, in a BMW car with 700 controls, or whatever it might be, or the European Space Agency cockpit where there were astronauts, and there was like a cockpit on the ground, and all the tech companies would send their latest technology to Noordweg in the Netherlands, and then you'd have people who were going to be in space for a while and be bored out of their minds. So you had to give them stuff to do to make them feel like they were worthwhile and useful. I mean, they're really only there in case anything goes wrong to fix it. But so you got people who you have to make feel like they're valuable and they're doing something worthwhile, like science and experiments. But you've got to make sure they can't get it wrong. In that context, we had models of astronauts, models of the crew workstation, trying to see how many windows they could open simultaneously, and if they have to do these jobs, water the plants, empty the toilet, check the dials, then how do you kind of configure that information? Anyway, so that was all got me interested in applied research for the first time, I guess. But in the end, it was just a model that generated hundreds of pages of numbers, but it was all based on intuition. It wasn't really scientific. I just go model something the way I thought seemed right. Then it could come with 500 pages of numbers and say, hey, the results show this is the right solution. And no one can argue with you because no one understands the numbers. But it looks so that was very applied research, but not very scientific. The TV stuff was sort of scientific and sensory, but maybe not so applied immediately. And ever since I've been trying to put those two things together, really working at the interface between basic lab research and then saying, well, why does this matter and how can we use it? And always with my sort of my parents' voice in the back of my head, why are people paying you for this? And we don't need a bloody psychologist to tell us that. So this is the kind of, sort of have to prove the value of what you're doing. And that will not come from theoretical know-how, at least to my parents.
Well, it is kind of interesting because like we have in this the senses or sensory research is so interdisciplinary, so you have so many different types of people working in the space. And so like for example, we have anthropological aspect. I always
Yeah.
stumble over that word. But I think it's interesting that you bring this like psychology background, experimental psychologist, I guess you call it, because it is an interesting aspect of the senses. And I don't know, like I don't think we necessarily think of psychology as that way.
I mean, it was by accident that I got into the world of food, saying that, and the chemical senses from an experimental point of view, because that was always something that food scientists did, not psychologists. They only did hearing and vision, and they only did one of those. There was a recount, and think at the start of Gastrophysics book or Sensehacking, arriving in Oxford to teach in '97, and there was a guy who studied vision, and he had his lab there, all black. And next to him was a guy who studied hearing, and they hadn't spoken to each other for decades, literally. And neither of them thought they were missing out. It's like, the senses are completely compartmentalized. And the brain's so complex that, it'll take a lifetime even to get a start on understanding your eyes. So who on earth would be stupid enough to try and study your eyes and your ears and your tongue and your nose all at the same time? Because that's just going to be too much. But now, at the same time, for me, yeah, I think, what the psychology brings is a very experimental approach. How do we measure this? How can we support claims for a perfume house or a fragrance house that this fragrance will do X? So one of my favorite ones was the smell of Axe or Lynx deodorant, which is a young boy's deodorant. And we had to prove that this would make young men more attractive to young women. And that was a very experimental approach. How do we measure this most robustly, quickly, cheaply, reproducibly? That's all great, but at the same time, from in the last few years, having more and more interactions and interdisciplinary workshops and grants with anthropologists, art historians, language scholars, and so on, it's also got me thinking that sort of the experimental approach maybe misses something too. And then this desire to always be able to measure things and control them and reproducibly do it. So much of the context and sort of sensorium that's sort of lost. And this is maybe sort of repeating David House's sort of thinking. And so now I'm going much more into sort of the history of the senses almost, and trying to trace back almost the sensory history of ingredients or flavors. So with things like sensory history of the pineapple and how that sort of changed, being first described in the 1580s when it first 1580s when it arrived in the UK, and only the king could eat it. And I think it's John Locke saying, can we describe the taste of a pineapple to somebody who's never tasted it, i.e. him and the rest of the population? This is the world's most delicious fruit. Today, no one would say that's the most delicious fruit 400 years later. So has the pineapple changed? Have we changed? Has both? And you can sort of track these sensory descriptions of this flavor over centuries they exist. And you can do the same thing for other herbs and spices. And some are really sort of getting more and more interested in this sort of contextual factors and history behind these sort of sensory experiences that you cannot capture so easily in the lab. Or if what you capture in the lab misses important stuff about our lived experience.
Yeah, and that's something that's so challenging about research within the senses. I mean, it's hard to capture everything, and it's also so subjective. Our experiences with our senses is subjective, so it depends on the person and the time and everything. So that's also, I think, something that's challenging about the research that you're doing, but also very fun and experimental, like you say. I want to talk about olfactory storytelling or smell and storytelling. That's something that I really am passionate about. And something that I use quite a lot in my work is in one of your papers about smell and cinema, you talk about pleonastic storytelling. Can you tell us about it a bit more, about pleonastic storytelling and smell?
Yep. So, over the last 5 years, in anticipation of this book, for which I have the perfect title, Sensehacking. It's just got to happen. I've been sort of dividing the world of entertainment up into chapters or papers, should we say, from live performance to cinema to VR to gaming and so on, and looking at the way that olfaction is used in storytelling to set moods, for example, or to break the fourth wall in sort of live performance setting. And an interesting disconnect between, in the case of cinema, people have been talking about smelly cinema, scratch and sniff movies for decades. They haven't arrived, and probably never will arrive. No one's interested really, or the technology is not up to it, or no one's figured out a way of introducing smells and removing them fast enough in space. But all the early promises have come to naught really. By contrast, in the world of live performance, it's sort of interesting that far fewer scents appear to be used than in the cinema, where in the cinema the temptation is always to do it technologically, digitally, with something reading the film camera roll and having like a smell channel there, and that being directed to a olfactometer that will pump out the smells at the right second, and there'll be a machine with lots of different smells. So in the cinema, it always ends up being high tech, maybe because film is sort of high tech, whereas in live performance that hasn't happened, and it seems to be much more. You might have somebody with a Dyson room fan spraying the thing, or you might have people wandering around the auditorium spraying. So it tends to be much more low tech, and as such, there tend to be far fewer scents that are used in live performance. And so these differences in how smell is used in different kinds of storytelling or entertainment are interesting to me, and why has that things evolved that way. And then it feels like scent in olfactory in cinematic storytelling has failed. Scent in live performance has sometimes worked. So what is it that has worked? Well, according to Sally Baines, is a person who has this great paper on smell in live performance from 2001. Not sure whether she's a theatrical scholar or something. And there she lists out kind of all the ways that scent could be used in live performance, including breaking the fourth wall. If you can smell the same thing, then you're not separated from those on stage. And that's something that's sort of harder to figure out how that would work in a cinematic setting. If you're seeing that people projected on the screen, then is there a fourth wall, or can you get through it by smell? I don't know. But in the live performance setting, you can use it for that. You could use it to induce a mood, to change the tone, to make a more immersive experience. But she's also kind of critical of some of the ways that scent is used, be it in live performance or in cinema. And namely, sort of the pleonastic use of, which is a word I had to look up because I've never heard of it before, which is sort of kind of redundantly using scent to indicate something that you can see. And so that's kind of pointless, unless it breaks the fourth wall, then it's got a purpose. But just by itself, why bother giving me the smell of pine if I can see a pine tree on stage? That doesn't really do anything. It's kind of redundant. It's a waste of, people are going to monitor more channels, and it doesn't deliver anything good. So she's much more of the view that you might use smell for some other purpose. So you might use it to, say, tell a joke, or to have a double meaning. So she goes back to, I think, the 1500s, the mystery plays in England, would be traveling troops who would do plays, and they'd start at the gates of hell, and you'd have like a sulphurous smell because the devil smells of sulphur for whatever reason. And these early mystery plays around 15, whenever it was, the gunpowder plot, when Guy Fawkes tried to blow up Parliament with gunpowder that smells of sulphur. And she says, in these early plays, they were using the smell of sulphur both to indicate gates of hell, but also to reference the gunpowder plot, which was current at the time. That was very clever, to this kind of a double meaning of smell. Or she says other cases where there's kind of a joke. So in some cinematic cases where you see the character, the detective, sort of having a black coffee, but then you smell brandy, and you know there's more in his coffee than just a. Or you see the character walking across the screen, they slip on the floor, and then you smell the banana. So sort of cheesy, cheap jokes, but that's giving you something more. And that for me has been sort of interesting. Well, is it enough to just merely present olfactorily what you can visually see or auditorily hear? I think not. In most cases, it has to do something more to merit the expense and the time and the difficulty of finding the scents and delivering them, with the knowledge that you can probably only really use a very small number of scents in any space to avoid. Otherwise, you'll end up with a sort of melange of odors, and no one knows what. Smells like somebody's boudoir rather than what it's meant to be. This, that, and the other. And again and again and again, when you start putting multiple scents in, that's what ends up happening. From the whatever it was in New York, the Sarakuchi Hartman's Journey to Japan in 11 Smells, or 11 Minutes, from 1904, I think it was. Again, he picks his 11 scents to go from New York to Japan. He picks his venue, and then it all goes wrong. And all smells mix up, and it's terrible. And I had a friend who just went to Barcelona last week to a cocktail bar where now they're accompanying all the cocktails with olfactory edible fragrances that you can spray over the drinks. The 3 or 4 of them at the table, they each had a different cocktail, so they each got a different spray over their drink. And again, it's a horrible mess. Right there at the moment, all those 4 smells are not staying with the drinks they're supposed to be with, but they're all sort of mixing. And the same thing in cinema. And it's who knows how we'll ever get over that.
Commingling of scents is a problem in especially throughout like cinema history when they've tried to incorporate scents. But one of the reasons why I love this term, especially in the work that I do with museums, is because it really reinforces that smell should be an interpretive and educational tool. So you're really trying to teach something through that scent rather than just reinforcing what can be seen in the artwork itself or on the sculpture or whatever that subject may be. So that's why I really like using this term to reinforce that really we can learn more from scent than just what is seen in something. So I've used it quite a lot in my work as well.
When I looked at the scent in the context of the museum, or art gallery or VR experience, then it seems a lot of people use a scent to try and increase immersion. The more multisensory, the more immersive, more feet through the door, and more we can justify the money we get. And yet, it seems to be that pleasant and neutral smells do nothing to immersion. It's only the bad smells that work. The smell of the toilet or of this kind of the fish market in the Viking Museum in New York here in the UK, and yeah, it's the bad ones. The pleasant and neutral. I guess interesting uses, and even going back to what I come across is the 1930s, was the first Dadaist art exhibitions or something, and they had the smell of coffee.
Futurists.
Futurists, yeah, smell of coffee there, and then what's that? Yeah, it is just a smell of coffee, but then it was when the Brazilians had just joined the futurists or something, or the other levels of meaning
Yeah,
potentially there.
exactly. So, from your perspective, what makes our sense of smell so powerful for, or a powerful vehicle of storytelling for any kind of media? Because it seems like entertainment is, that can be anything. So, why do you think the sense of smell is a powerful vehicle for storytelling?
I think that can be a powerful aid to storytelling. I'm not sure I've seen any examples where it is successful in its own right. Back to the Hartmann example from 1904, the trip to Japan through whatever it was, the scent opera that was in the Green Opera or something in the States a few years ago, where it just sort of turn the lights off and just have scent and sound. Yeah, it feels like the smells evolve and can be cleared too slowly, that the sort of tempo is not, you can't have the tempo of sequential smells to deliver a story or entertainment in its own right. So like, I think the storytelling has to come through some other senses, but you could potentially augment it well through scent. And that maybe, you might have to take away vision to sort of foreground scent. And for me, one of my favorite examples ever was from the Future of Storytelling conference in New York in 2016. And there were some Dutch artists who got two mortuary trays, slabs, where you keep the bodies cool. There's a metal thing, you slide them in and shut the door. They've got two of these, and they invited you in to live the last 5 minutes of JFK's life or Whitney Houston's life. So you lay on the mortuary sort of slab, and then we're slid into this thing. The door slammed. It's completely pitch dark. You're on your back, so you can lost some of your vestibular stuff. And in that context, then you have 5 minutes of just sounds and scents. And there, in that confined space, scent felt like it played a more important role in the experience. So it almost became that you could support storytelling through just that. But most of the time, I think it's an augmentation. And the challenge, in a way, I'm sure I can prove that I could sell you a plugin for your digital media, however you like to watch, I don't know, the World Cup, that will pump out the smell of fresh cut grass. And I could do the experiment, because I'm a psychologist, that would prove your enjoyment of the World Cup was that much higher, elevated through the addition of scent. But the problem is you'll never pay for the refill, because I think it's like this fundamental misattribution error that none of us really think olfactorially. And so I think what happens is you will attribute your enjoyment in the football game to the great play, to the number of pixels on your screen. So you'll misattribute your enjoyment experience to the dominant sense. And until you can figure out a way of overcoming that, be it in a car where you have, scent entertainment systems there now that will match the scenery sometimes, or again, no one's going to pay for the refills because we're not aware of what scent does for us, even though I can measure what it does for us. And hence, yeah, in the end, I'm sort of, perhaps gloomy. Yeah, I'm enthusiastic about scent's role in storytelling, hence the book's entertainment, but not without recognizing the sort of huge challenges that I'm not sure have necessarily been cracked yet, really, to make it something that people would pay a premium for as an augmentation.
It's very interesting that, like, because I haven't really thought about scent that way, like how it's an aid, or it's something that goes on that goes with the other senses. So usually the storytelling is not the scent. And I haven't really thought about that before.
And maybe it's just that, I think it's both the technologically, unless you're in a very, very confined space or with a smell device right close to your nose, you simply cannot work through the sense fast enough. And then our sort of sense of smell is kind of slower anyway. That, yeah, I think we're just accustomed to fast storytelling. And so either cognitively or technologically, we cannot keep smells coming at the rate that we expect. So maybe there are ways of slowing us down, having more mindful moments and a bit more forest bathing or something, or maybe there are other kinds of entertainment that are much slower, that do work to the natural rhythm of sense, but they are, yeah, clearly aren't the dominant modes currently, and it seems to be faster, more quicker. Seems to be
I,
what
I
grabs
think
people's attention.
I think that the museum is a great place for scents because a lot of the time you're able to contextualize them really well. But I also love like thinking about VR and incorporating scent in VR because it's such a new medium and it's something that I've also researched in the past because I think it's really interesting, especially since cinema, it's like cinema is more traditional medium. Will it change necessarily? It hasn't so far. I mean, other than when we introduced sound a long time ago. But in terms of incorporating scent into cinema, I think it's a little bit more challenging than VR. And there are companies that are incorporating scent into VR.
And maybe they say, well, that does, yes, that works in a sense. You can deliver the smell direct to the nose. So you've got some apparatus over your head, so there's less of a problem of clearing the space. And yet no one has. I mean, it's like the color printer problem of DigiSense of 25 years ago. That all people will want is the burnt rubber of the kinky sex is all drive olfactory stuff. And when that capsules run out, who's gonna are you gonna buy? Who's gonna stock every single scent that you need for your VR experience? So you're actually limited to a very small number, given we don't know how to mix scents. And then how many whiffs of a scent do you get before? Even just now, practically, we've got a student Yang who's doing the haptic cinema case, and she's also got a flower clock. So it's clock that with 3D printed flowers that open and close, analog, so the old style, different flowers for each hour of the day, and they open and close sort of magically at the right time. Building on Linnaeus's flower clock from 1700s, and we thought, well, let's put some scent with it, a different scent for each hour of the day. So it'll be a multi-sensory flower clock, and you can tell the time just by, yes, it's 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock. But then to find a device that could deliver the scent for us, or 12 cents, and then how it would be refilled, just practically it becomes almost a nice idea, but impossible in practice to deliver,
Yep.
sadly. And that also gets into the thing of so often when scent is delivered for an entertainment experience or a scratch and sniff or a multisensory smell, we're being like smell and music tasting things that we're doing at the moment, then very often the smell will be synthetic. It won't be a very good representation of scratch and sniff chocolate. Sort of smells like chocolate-ish, I guess. Like a synthetic strawberry sort of smells like strawberry, but it's not like a real strawberry. Difficult to know how to. That's another cost, I guess. It's very hard to get a really authentic smell of many things that you might want.
The practical issues or challenges with
Mm-hmm.
smell and entertainment. So to wrap up, can you tell me a little bit about what you're up to now? Maybe your book. It sounds like you have a book coming out at some point.
A few. One that just came out, digital dining, digital gastronomy, digital dining, looking at AI and food and flavor and such like, which is fun. And a couple of new ones coming out on sort of music and correspondences. So these kind of almost synesthetic connections between the senses, such that red is sweet, but sweet is also round, high pitched, bitter is angular, low pitched dark, sour is. So now we're finding all these surprising connections between the senses, between touches, tastes, textures, timbres, that are kind of like synesthesia, but not really, because we all agree sweet is round, whereas synesthetes, each one probably has a somewhat different experience. And so these cross-modal correspondences are the focus for a lot of our research, and as we try now to, in one project to make music to match four different perfumes, four pieces of music. So people could hear the music and say, yeah, that's that perfume, that's that perfume. So kind of cross-modal matching, or theoretically, well, or if you're trying to make, music to match a visual work of art, or a scent to match a painting, there's all versions of this kind of cross-modal correspondences, and it's a lot of fun. Gets to work with a lot of creative people, who scent makers or perfume designers or musicians, but at the same time, it's also challenging. Currently, as we're thinking about when do your senses like to stay by themselves, and when do they cross? So if I give you, I don't know, a round thing and a sweet thing, you'll put them together because there's one thing in each sense. But if I give you a whole meal, then there are lots of tastes and flavors one after the other, and that creates kind of a its own narrative journey. So why wouldn't I match the taste with the rest of the meal? Why would I suddenly take that taste and match it to what I'm hearing across the senses? So there's this kind of challenge of when and how do the senses group within the sense? The sounds go together, the tastes go together, and when and how do we get people to kind of make the connections? If we only give people one thing of each modality, then you can do it because they only have one thing to match, so that's going to be the way they match it. But any real artistic or entertainment you can think of will have a sequence of multiple elements in, and then maybe the within sensory grouping dominates, and hence you might lose some. That's keeping us again. It's sort of the challenges really. I sort of like to believe that you could make music that would correspond with a perfume.
Yeah.
When you come to do it practically, then suddenly all these challenges you hadn't thought of.
Well, and
Different
there
from the
might be some
challenges of
people that say that doesn't match.
yeah, that's fine too. And they'd be
Yeah.
right. But yeah, as long as I can get one that the majority of people.
Yeah. It's
We've
really
done it for
interesting.
tastes. We've done it for the perfumes are kind of harder because they're all sort of pleasant and they're all sort of intense and they all sort of have top notes, middle notes, and base notes. And
I had a brilliant student when I taught Caro Verbeek's class Knowing by
right.
Sensing one year. And I had a brilliant student who was very inspired by in the class when we presented Kiki and Bobo.
Yep.
And so she took the project, her project to, she had different fruits and she used AI to make music for each fruit.
Mhm.
And how the fruit would be represented by music. And then
Yep.
she staged this whole party experience where everybody was able to taste the fruit and listen to the music
Yep.
and talk about how that, whether they matched, whether they didn't
Yep.
match, and how it impacted their experience. And I thought that was such a cool project.
Mm-hmm.
And so it sounds kind of like what you're saying,
Yeah.
but it's so interesting because her music for each of these fruits really worked. Like, and for some reason in my head and a lot of different people's heads, that was the music that went to that fruit.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's interesting to think about why. And I guess
Mm-hmm.
that's also what what a lot of your research is
Yep.
doing. So it's great. Well, thank you so much for your time. And yeah, I look forward to reading your book, your next book that comes out.
Thank you.